By now, most people have been asked the question, man or bear? When you're alone and walking in the park, which would you rather come across? Or better yet, which one would you rather your daughter encounter while she is by herself? Many say bear for a multitude of reasons. A bear can kill you, a bear can harm you, a bear can leave you with life-altering injuries that will require extensive medical care and leave you with the question, why did this happen to me? And a man can do the same things. The difference between man and bear being, as that woman recovers and then finds herself alone, she will again encounter strange men. We recognize not all men, not even the majority of men, have ill intentions. But her heart will still race, her shoulders will still tense, and a scream will start to bubble up in her throat at the idea that this could happen a second time. And because of that, we often feel safer in parks, especially parks that are frequented by many visitors, and comforted by the fact that we are not alone on these trails. That if something happens, she can scream and others will hear. But human predators can be vile and vicious, and one woman with a premonition that she would die young falls silent. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I am your host, Kayla, and Caitlin is back with me for this true crime episode.
Yes.
And today first thing I'm going to say is that I'm sorry for anyone listening if the audio is off, because I feel like I'm throwing this together between going to 3 different libraries, trying to find a space to be able to do this. And I personally just don't like the way that my AirPods come across in recordings. So that's, I guess, my disclaimer is that I'm sorry for the audio if it sounds bad. And if it doesn't, I'll just cut this part out and move on. So today we are going to Olympic National Park, which is located in the far northwest of Washington State. Olympic National Park holds almost 1 million acres of protected wilderness and indigenous history. Encompassed in this area are vast changes from ocean coastline to glacier-capped mountains and old-growth forest and a temperate rainforest. The old-growth forest in Olympic National Park is over 1,000 years old. The glaciers that recede from the area roughly 10,000 years ago slowly left really high nutrient-based soil and water behind, and this allowed plant and animal to flourish because these soils were allowing the climate and the ecosystem here to grow and develop in massive proportions. And you can see that when you're there, the trees are impossibly tall. Like, as someone from Ohio, I never thought that I would see trees as high as I did, and they're not even like the tallest trees in the world. So they're really cool. As the glaciers left, it allowed the space for foliage to flourish and flowers of every color to bloom in the spring. Pika, fox, coyote, bear, beavers, and elk are all found in the park, and the diverse landscape also allows for a variety of snakes, salamanders, and bugs to thrive. And I have a question. For those listening, Caitlin is Sam's sister. And if there's anything you need to know about Sam, it's that he will ask questions about anything and everything.
Yes.
And did he ask you the bug question last week?
No, he did not. Bless me.
Okay. So he had, I apparently at some point he was like, do bugs like what do you think the like quantity or percentage of bugs are that just like randomly run into things? And do they like know that they're running into things? Like are they that clumsy or like do they not even know that they're hitting things? And so this sparked like a whole conversation about bugs and uh he had like the entire gym talking about it and like class was running late and like we were like okay we need to get off of this subject. So that was just a nice uh depending on how much you like bugs a nice little side note. um
Or or nature. You're saying this thing has gone like uninterrupted, so it's like the more nature takes over, the more bugs and like wild creatures are gonna take over. So it's beginning to
yeah,
sound less idyllic of a place to go.
it is. Olympic is one of those places where I mean, there's case on top of case on top of case of people getting lost in Olympic National Park and never being seen again. And
Is
it's
there like
just because
a cave there or something? Is that what it is? There's like an undiscovered cave and there's people falling into it.
maybe I think the foliage is just so dense and there's so because there's like mountains and a very large difference of terrain in the area, it's also really easy for somebody to fall into a body of water and then just get washed away because the amount of water in the spring that comes off of those mountains from the snow melting is insane.
This is what I'm thinking. I'm not well versed in nature. Like I enjoy it and everything for running, but don't you have to have like a different skill set going on different terrains? Like mountains versus trails versus like you have to have I feel like those are two different types of personalities of people who like the like you're very nichey when it comes to nature types. I don't know.
Yeah, I think in certain spaces that is the case where like if you were like truly getting onto the mountain, then you would probably need to have some mountaineering experience or be with someone who's experienced so that way you know what to watch out for and you know kind of where to go.
Right.
Um
Whole
and
podcast is about the risks because nature's therapeutic, but there's still a lot of risks involved when you're off the grid and
yeah,
you have no help for you. You have to know what you're doing. So,
yeah. Yeah, it takes the right person to be able to thrive out there. And even when you do have the right person, sometimes you don't. And that's something that we're talking about today. Um,
yes.
so Olympic National Park was established in 1938 under President Franklin Roosevelt's guide. And this park has been in the top 10 most visited national parks for several years. There are three separate ecosystems within the park boundaries, including the temperate rainforest, which receives 150 inches of rain each year. The Hoh rainforest is located on the west side of the park. And then on the east side of the park is the old growth forest. And then, of course, you have the Pacific coastline. So the park has 32 named glaciers and 11 major rivers flowing through it, along with alpine meadows, waterfalls, hot springs, tide pools, sandy beaches, and offshore erosion formed rocks. So they're like it almost looks like somebody like stacked rocks on top of each other, but there's no like separation in the layers. And it's basically there was like a pillar of rock that the water washed away and eroded. And so now there's just these like stone stacks in the water. And as like the water recedes during like high tide and low tide, you can find them a lot easier. So Hurricane Ridge, Hoh Rainforest, Ruby Beach, and Lake Crescent are all major highlights of the area, but one should never forget about Cape Alava. Cape Alava is the westernmost point of the continental United States, and it is located in the Ozette Indian Reservation inside of Olympic National Park. From the Cape, you will see spectacular views where, if you're lucky, both orca whales and gray whales frequent while migrating from the Bering Sea. With binoculars, you might also find humpback whales, fin whales, sperm whales, and blue whales. River otters and sea otters, along with Californian sea lions and harbor seals, are also common in the area. When the tide goes out or during low tide, the water recedes a far distance from where it typically is, leaving large rocks and pools of water behind and creating a whole different experience than if you are in the area during high tide. You can only reach this point by hiking the Ozette Triangle Loop. This loop is also known as the Cape Alava Loop, and it is actually two trails connecting to make one. The first winds you through the forest, and then the other takes you out to the beach. The Cape Alava Trail out to the beach and back is 6.2 miles or 10 kilometers, or you can also continue south along the beach for a ways to find the Sandpoint Trail for a 9.4 mile or 15 kilometer loop style trail. In 1977, Jane Constantino is a vibrant and adventurous 28-year-old. She was blonde and athletic and kind, and while she often joked that she had no fears, the reality was that anything that did scare her, she would try to conquer. Jane grew up in Long Island and attended Fordham University, which is located in New York City. She then worked as a social worker for a few years in the city, but very quickly figured out that the city felt confining and was looking for her outlet outdoors. Jane had previously met and married a man while she was in Europe and moved to Colorado with him. However, after 2 years, their marriage would fall apart, but because she still loved Colorado, she decided to stay in the Denver area. Jane was often working extremely hard as a waitress to save money for her summer adventures and was often found working 7 days a week so that way she would be able to take months off at a time in the summers, where she would then drive around in an old Volkswagen Bug to get her anywhere she wanted to go. Having the premonition that she would die young, Jane set out to accomplish all of her goals and explore the incredible highs as well as the horrendous lows that life had to offer. Jane and her climbing partner, Ralph Hill, were in Grand Teton National Park, climbing a ridge when a thunderstorm rolled in. And if anyone has listened to my previous episodes, it's a two-part episode called Dancing with Death. You already know what's coming. The ridge is a classic for climbers, and from the top of this ridge, you have multiple options to summit Grand Teton, also known as the Grand, which stands 13,776 feet or 4,199 meters tall. They didn't have any form of shelter to hide in or wait out the storm, so the pair would have to continue climbing to get to the safest place they could, which was at the top of that ridge. They climbed through rain, hail, and snow, not taking any of their grip or footholds for granted. Once they reached the top of the lower ridge, they paused here to wait for the storm to pass, and it was here that tragedy would strike. At about 12:30 p.m., lightning struck the peak of the Grand, and Jane and Ralph felt the current as it passed from the rock and into their bodies. The current was strong enough that it caused both of them to have burns, but they were alive. For about an hour, both Jane and Ralph were completely unable to help themselves, and they basically just felt like they were sitting ducks. Finally, they bit the bullet and wrapped each other's burns and climbed over Exum Ridge and then rappelled down, where they would finally arrive at the lower saddle at about 8:30 p.m. Here, they spent the night before finally making the several-mile hike to the Jenny Lake Ranger Station. Rangers Dave Carmen and Jan Boyle noted that Jane had burns from the top of her shoulder down to her elbow on her right arm, as well as burns across her back and onto her left arm. The burns on her right arm, though, were the most severe, and they described them as third-degree burns in places. And in addition to this, the socks inside of her boots had disintegrated due to the lightning strike.
This is so, I don't know what I expected someone struck by lightning to suffer, but I thought it was more like I would have never expected burns. I would have expected like your whole system, like your heart stops or like something like that. Not
Yeah,
burns. I was
yeah,
not
so it completely depends on where you're struck. And so if it's just like flesh, you do get burns. Um,
That's
if
weird. And think this is a person who's like, I'm gonna die young anyway. So here, I like when I was young, I was like, I'm gonna live long. Like I had that premonition or whatever. So it's like me and her are opposite. So if I'm like thinking I'm just gonna die young, like she's probably like just another day, whatever. I just got struck by lightning. Whatever, it's just another day. I mean, I have a few more days to live, I guess, whatever. Like for me, it would be like, oh my God, I have like 70 years. I gotta go. Like it's just happening.
yeah, and I mean, I kind of think that way too, that like I feel like I'm gonna have a long life, so I might as well like I don't need to rush and I don't need to
Exactly,
check
exactly.
everything off right now. Um,
Yeah, there's not this like she sounds like she has a fire in her soul, like she's trying to fit it all in because she has such short time. She's thinking she has her soul like knows somehow. So
yeah,
way different.
yeah. So this experience was not the beginning nor the end of the close calls that Jane would experience in her life. Jane had also nearly drowned while in a river in Katmai National Park area of Alaska. She had slipped and almost fell from a mountain ridge, breaking her ankle and receiving a concussion while she was climbing in Yosemite National Park. And of course, other times she had flawless adventures, such as in 1979, she climbed Mount Baker and then Mount St. Helens within a 9 day period, missing the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption by just a couple of months.
She did those alone because the first was with her husband, so she's going alone on all these things.
Some of them, yes, and others of them, she has somebody with her.
Okay. To be their marriage counselor after the lightning incident, because you know they had something, and their marriage was so short. It'd be like that would be an interesting session. I would love that.
Caitlin wants to dissect it now.
Yeah.
So she also biked to Mexico from Washington. She then biked alone from Nova Scotia to New York, where she ended up in the hospital for several days after being struck by a truck. In 1980, Jane decided that she was going to take her biggest adventure yet, planning her route as she and her brother were going to bike from Denver to New York City. And I want to clarify one thing really quick. If you're hearing bike, I'm not talking motorcycles, I'm talking bicycles.
Oh, I knew
So,
what you were saying. Because she's so
okay.
crazy. I knew what she was doing. Like, this
Well,
is like Forrest Gump kind of girl. She's like, I'm just gonna take a walk, and then you keep walking until you're across the country. Like,
yeah, I
this is
just
that.
felt like running.
Yeah.
um, well, I wanted to make that clarification because I have family members who are motorcycling everywhere that they can. Yeah, so my great uncle, I think, was in Alaska and he had a bear cross the road in front of him and he almost hit the bear. He said he my whole family pretty much grew up in Northwest Ohio. We are not bear people. And so he apparently was like, oh my God, this thing was the size of an SUV. And so, which is funny for me to hear, especially because I love bears so much. It's like, I, one, I appreciate you not hitting that bear. Two, I'm sure you appreciate not hitting that bear while on a motorcycle.
Yeah.
And three, why couldn't that have been me?
Well, first of all, you're just like, we're not bear people. Who the heck is a bear person? Like, what do you mean? They like grew up, they hibernate with bears. Like, what do they do? Oh my gosh, I'm rewatching Wednesday Addams, and she's like, that doesn't faze me. I hibernated with grizzlies once. And I was like, what?
Yes.
Girl, girl.
All
Like, what?
right. Well, reining it back in, we're not going to dig in too much about bears, even though we could. So her trip from Denver to New York with her brother went flawlessly. And once she flew back to Colorado, she just felt like she wasn't done. So she decided that since she already went to the most eastern side of the continental US, she was going to go to the most western side of the continental US. And so she decided that she was going to go to Cape Alava. She was going to dip her bicycle wheels into the ocean, and this was going to conclude her summer adventures. So off she sets to bike to Washington. Everything goes smooth. And once she reached the Ozette Indian Reservation on July 23rd, 1980, she decided to attend an archaeological presentation, and this would be the last time that Jane would have smooth sailing, so to speak. After the presentation, Jane set off down Cape Alava Loop Trail, heading towards Cape Alava. At about 3 p.m., a group of hikers were on the same trail, also heading towards the ocean. As they came around a corner on the trail, they saw a woman lying face down. They were about a quarter mile from the ocean at this point. So this group picks up their pace to assist the fainted woman that they very quickly realize there was a much larger problem. As they approached her, they found that her shirt was drenched with bright red blood. This group immediately starts trying to determine if Jane was still alive, but they were unable to find a pulse or determine if she was still taking any breaths. As members of the group are trying to care for Jane, another member runs to the closest payphone and calls the police. And because of the nature of the crime, 3 separate agencies respond. These agencies are Kayla County Sheriff's deputies, tribal police from the Ozette Indian Reservation, and then rangers from the U.S. Park Service. Officers were on the scene within minutes, and this was due because the Coast Guard used a helicopter to pick up officers and detectives from Kayla County Sheriff's Office and brought them to the beach where, again, Jane was laying roughly a quarter mile away from. Park Rangers Gordon Boyd and Stephen Underwood, along with Deputy Michael Lenahan, were the first to observe the crime scene and pretty quickly determined that Jane had clearly died from multiple stab wounds to the chest, and that this clearly meant that it was not an accident. And they also determined that she likely lost a lot of blood quickly, meaning that she would have died quickly. They carefully went through her backpack and found her driver's license, which identified her as Jane Constantino, 32 years old. This attack appeared to be an intended homicide as Jane was fully clothed. Her clothing had not been rearranged at all, and there was no signs that she had been sexually assaulted before, during, or after the attack.
Her clothing not rearranged, but she was laying face down, and he placed her that way. That was my first thought, is he places her face down.
Yeah. So, as more personnel arrive on the scene, the investigators start to organize a grid search of the park, searching in the area that they found Jane in. There was some timing concerns because even though Jane was very quickly discovered and officers were able to respond within minutes, Olympic National Park is ginormous and also very dense, and they feared that the person that they were looking for would be able to slip away unnoticed. The detectives started putting together what they assumed the killer would either look like or be like, and because of the depths of the wounds and the angle of the wounds, they determined that the killer must be a man, he must be tall, he either had to be a very strong individual or he was a very large individual. In fact, the 6 stab wounds in Jane's chest were so deep that the coroner would later report that the person who dealt the blows would have had to have been of above average strength.
Do we know anything about her physicality? Like, she's obviously very athletic and she can deal with a lot of pain, but do we know, like, her height, her weight, or anything?
I don't know her height or weight, but based on the description that I have gathered of her, I would probably put her at like average average height for a woman, which is like 5'3", 5'4", 5'5". I don't know specifically in the 1980s what that would have been,
Yeah.
but also slim and muscular. I don't have an idea of weight, but I mean she's clearly very physically fit. She climbs mountains, she rock climbs, she bikes all over the United States. So she's, you
Right.
know, physically capable of probably more than the average woman at that
But
time.
mentally, I feel like mentally, her mentals are an advantage and disadvantage because she's fearless, so it gives her capabilities to do all these things, but also it means that she doesn't see threats all around her like most of the average like woman who's like, "Wow, I'm not equipped to fight a big man off, so I'm very wary." Like she probably doesn't have that because she's like fearless. She's the type of friend you need to have on Find My. Like they didn't have that back then. But you need to be like, where is she? Where's Jane? Like all the time. You need tabs on her, air tags, and every like everywhere. This girl's everywhere.
Yeah. So the police begin to question people that they come across and start to escort from the park. Many recalled seeing Jane and that she was being followed by a big, bulky man who had black hair, was wearing a cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and a purple shirt.
That's a
In
pretty
fact,
description, though.
it
Someone was
is.
attention.
It is. Also, especially because another woman told police that she was approached by the same man and how he was acting raised the hair on the back of her neck. She told them the story about how this man started to follow her, but no matter how quickly she walked, it seemed like he was just catching up to her faster and faster. Before she was able to reach the beach area, he had caught up to her and mentioned that she was beautiful and that he was a photographer for Playboy and he was offering her $50 to pose for him naked.
Oh man, I wish he would have did that to me because he would have not heard the end of that. I would have been like calling one right away. Right away.
Oh, yeah. So she said that by the way he was handling himself, coupled with the fact that he didn't seem to have a camera or a camera bag with him, made this woman extremely uneasy. And so she told him that he needed to go away, he needed to leave her alone. She wasn't interested. Like, get away from me, essentially. And it was in that moment that another woman came around the turn on the trail, caught the attention of this man, and he simply stared at her before he turned away and started following her down the trail.
So
Woman had a bike with her.
she was saved only by distraction.
She was saved by Jane.
Yeah.
So once his attention was no longer on her, this other woman ran away and didn't think much of it because she thought that if something happened with this other woman, that she would hear this other woman scream or make some sort of commotion, and she would be able to, at that point know that there was a problem and maybe do something. She additionally described this man as really big, probably over 6 feet, and kind of blubbery around the middle, not real clean. He was wearing a purple shirt and a cowboy hat. She also mentions that he might have been in his late 30s to early 40s age range. It was at this point in the retelling that she started to break down and worry that her leaving led to Jane's death, and said that if she had stayed, maybe she could have helped her and maybe the two of them could have fought him off. And the officer who was interviewing her very generously pointed out that staying with Jane could have led to both of them being killed.
Yep.
In addition to this, it was later discovered that this man was also stalking one of the archaeologists for the Ozette Reservation. This woman's name was Stephanie Ludwig, and while she was on the beach, she ended up having to go into the tide because she noticed that he wasn't following her into the water. And Stephanie was able to get away from him by doing this. And it would be because he would later say that he was wearing cowboy boots and he didn't want to get the leather wet. So then, as officers are talking to other groups of hikers, they are learning that this man had been seen by two other hikers who barely stepped off the path in time before this man almost knocked into them. They mentioned that he seemed like he was in a hurry, and if they hadn't stepped out of his way, he would have just pushed them out of his way. He was, again, wearing a purple shirt, and he had dark red stains going down the front of it. At the time, they didn't think anything of the stains, assuming that he had been eating berries and just wiped his hands on his shirt.
This was the 80s. This happened nowadays, I think people with true crime being something that has a bigger following, people would be like on it. Because I was just running this morning and I feel like since our last podcast, I've been more aware of like watching people and like seeing if there's anything wrong, amiss going on. Because I'm like, I might be a witness to something. I might,
Yeah,
something might be happening. Because I mean, not like we talked about last time, like where that girl felt bad. Not that we can do anything physically, but there are things you can do. Being aware is one of those things.
yeah. And something that I've learned recently, which is it's kind of like a duh, of course thing, but like say something happens in an area that you were in and you saw nothing. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, you had no idea that something was going on. That is still information that investigators could use to narrow down a search window. So, like, for example, I ran this trail, like, I have it tracked on my GPS because I wear a watch while I'm running. And this is the trail that I ran. These are the times that I was running. I started here, I ended here, and I saw nothing, I heard nothing. And that would be an indication for them to be like, okay, now we don't necessarily need to go to this extent to search this area because we already have information gathered that nothing happened there.
Exactly.
Um,
It doesn't matter. You don't have to be the absolute first-hand witness of the exact moment, but there are things like if like for me, I run at the same time every day, and sometimes there's weird anomalies, like this weird guy in a go-kart at the park, and I'm like, what is he doing? Like that's not normal. He's not here. I'm here every morning.
yeah.
I know what goes on and I know who's here. There's a rooster some reason in my park. He comes down at like 5:30. So like there's a routine. Like hit the
Oh,
same spot every day, you know what's normal, quote unquote, and what's not. So yeah, that definitely is valuable.
yeah. So, as park rangers Boyd and Underwood and Deputy Lenahan walked down the trail towards the beach and searched for the man that matched this description that they had now heard multiple times, they noticed a man. He was burly. He was wearing a black cowboy hat. He had on a soaking wet purple shirt, but the purple shirt did not have any stains on it. Still, they intervened and the rangers and deputies searched him. Deputy Lenahan found a hunting knife that was tucked into his belt and then several lengths of rope that came from his pockets. One of the rangers found his wallet and pulled out his driver's license and found that this man was Dale Harrison. He was 37 years old and he was from Washington. They immediately arrest him under the suspicion of murder. And once more questions were asked by the FBI Special Agent Paul Mack, Dale insisted he was not the one to murder Jane. Rather, he was a witness. He saw the stabbing by another man who had taken Dale's knife, and then he rushed to help Jane. And when he found that she had already died, that's when he noticed that he had blood all over his shirt, and then he panicked. So he first tried to rub the blood off of the shirt, which spread it around more. And then he decided,
Typical bachelor doesn't know how to do laundry, blood stains. Come on now.
don't rub. You don't rub.
No, no, we do not.
So he then was like, oh, I'll just go to the ocean and wash my shirt there so the blood will come off. And he did this, he says, because he didn't want to automatically be labeled as a killer, especially because he had a background. When Special Agent Mack searched his name, Dale was not on any wanted list. However, he had multiple sex-related charges filed against him almost 2 decades prior. Dale had been convicted for molesting two young girls in 1962 when he would have been 19 years old. During this attack, on these two younger girls, he used a knife to threaten them. He served 2 years and was released on parole in 1965, and since then he had a seemingly clean history. Dale had gotten married, he and his wife had two children, and he had a good job working for a labor company as a forklift operator. But Dale's description matches multiple people's details of what they saw in the park and the uneasiness that he caused with his behavior. The hunting knife was shown to match the stab wounds in Jane's chest, and once they tested Dale's shirt, they found traces of human blood that matched Jane's genotype. The genotype is kind of like the genetic makeup of the blood. It is not the same thing as blood type. So there are 5 genotypes, and these types can produce essentially the shape of your blood cells. It's basically whether those blood cells are functioning or non-functioning, and how the shape has the ability to flow in the proper manner and take the proper amount of oxygen to different places. And so really only like 3 of those genotypes are compatible with life. The other 2 are just they're either non-viable or they're very short lifespan. So clearly not Jane's situation. So from my understanding, being able to match the blood type is essentially a step closer than matching the genotype, but it was still a match. So Dale was arrested and held on $100,000 bail. The investigators would end up talking to a gentleman who claimed to be one of Dale's best friends, and he talked about how Dale had been obsessing for about a year and a half over a very detailed plan that he had. I don't mean to laugh, but your reaction was funny.
Something that irritates me, because my favorite part of true crime, which is not related to this, is spousal murders. And that's always the case. Oh, he mentioned it like 52 times he was gonna kill Diane, but I wasn't sure he was gonna do it. I'm like, oh my God. I
Yeah,
like it could be prevented. These things can be prevented. Like, why are
I
you covering?
agree.
Oh my gosh, so frustrating.
So Dale tells this friend, and his friend makes sure to put in the words that Dale told him excitedly about a plan. And the idea was to find a woman alone in the woods. They would be so far away from anything else that, of course, this woman would be scared and helpless. Dale would continue on to describe how he would use the rope to tie up the woman so she couldn't escape, use the knife as a way to coerce her into obeying him while he made her his sex slave. And he even asked his friend to join him.
I wonder what his friend is probably censoring what his response was to the police, because you know how men, like if you're a fly on the wall as a woman, like their talks with each other about what they enjoy is way uncensored compared to what we hear. So I'm just wondering what the actual conversation was.
They
Yeah.
professionalized it for sure. They were like, oh, we can't have like the classic locker room talk here. I'm talking to officials, and oh my gosh, it sounds like Dale might have killed this woman. And oh my gosh, he talked about doing something to a woman in the woods. He killed this woman in the woods. Like things are starting to like click into and make sense. And it's not like I think a lot of people just automatically assume that certain people, like when they talk about some sort of sexual act that they want to do, that it's just a kink. And it's like just their thing and it's what turns them on, and that's just it. Whether it's something really simple or
Like
or
that.
very
Because
violent.
Here's the biggest thing for like the deeper you go into, not that I'm well versed in this, but the deeper you go into very violent, aggressive sexual habits, the more consent and the more safety measures are taken because both parties are consenting. Therefore,
Yeah.
this is not it. This is pure rape. This is pure violation. This is pure crime. There's nothing kinky fun about this. Nothing. Zero.
Yeah. And
Zero.
to add to that, you say no at any time, and that takes away the permission, right? So like even if
Yeah.
I was like, "Ooh, let's go out in the woods and we'll pretend to meet each other and I'll be helpless and you'll be my hero and I'll do anything to help you or to thank you." It's like if I get out there and I'm like, "Oh, now I'm uncomfortable, let's quit." You need to be able to trust that that person will quit.
Well,
Like
that's the
this
thing
is
is
this is
you're allowed
not a kink. This is
to start at any time. It doesn't matter if you start. That's the essence of consent that a lot of people, yeah, that's the essence. You can tap out at any time. You can be three-quarters of the way in and be like, nope, I don't want to finish.
yeah.
And that's that, the end.
Yeah.
So
So this like clearly goes beyond like just a kink and just a
because what
fascination. Like,
the biggest thing about his is he wants to violate her boundaries and her consent. That's number one red flag right there.
and
He's
she
not
probably
He's not
be
finding someone on Craigslist who's like, yeah, I want to do it. No, he's not finding someone who's volunteering herself. No.
right. And you've already pointed out that she's pretty fearless. She's also worked as a waitress, so she probably has experience with being like,
No.
"Oh, this guy's hitting on me." Like I can like passively dismiss it and move on with whatever I'm doing. And she probably also has experience with men not taking her, dismissing them, and having to become a little bit more assertive in her stance. And she probably had to do that here, which likely pissed him off. And because the knife was easy and he was mad and he was being denied, not once, not twice, but now three times, he took it out on her and took her life from her. So,
The first woman where we heard the whole interaction, I'm thinking if I was personally dealing with that and I'm alone, I wouldn't have even responded, interacted. The first time I heard the word Playboy or something, I would have been running the other direction. Do not engage with the terrorist, like
yes,
because for me there's like easy red flags, like, so I'm just like, no, because there's no way to speak to someone who's like that in a reasonable way. There's no logical conclusion here.
yeah,
So no. Mm-mm.
yeah, I just straight up ignore. Like somebody whistles at me, ignore it. If somebody hollers at me, I ignore it. I don't turn my head. I don't look. I don't blink. I just move forward because I don't know what that person's intentions are. They might be fine. Like most of the time they're fine. They don't care. But there's been more than one time that I've been followed, and at that point, like I have to start getting aggressive because I want to go home to my kid and I want to go home to my family. Coming back to Dale, he would go on trial in November of 1980 for his crimes against Jane, and a jury found him guilty. His attorney, Dan Dubinsky, tried to argue that Dale was mentally ill, but Judge Donald Verhees denied this on December 5th, 1980, denying Dale the potential to be a subject of a psychiatric study, which, if found that he was mentally ill, could have allowed him for a chance at early parole. With this not being the case, though, Dale was sentenced to life in prison.
Do we
Gen-
know anything about Dale? Like, because usually that presents like early on. Do we know anything about his life early on? Like, he has his friends saying he currently wants to commit something, but like, this is, did he have teenage friends saying he wanted to do something too? Like, how long is this
well,
going?
I mean, unfortunately, there wasn't much of a record in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I think crimes against women were taken less seriously when and I'm going to call them minor, even though I don't actually believe that they were minor, but like minor instances of stalking or like some sort of harassment or some sort of, you know, being touched inappropriately. Like those things, like people were just like, ah, boys. And it wasn't taken as seriously as we take it today. So I think the problem with Dale is that he just didn't get caught. And
That's what amazes me too about these things. He's 37, married,
two
functional.
kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, generally speaking, life imprisonment means that the person convicted will spend the rest of their life in prison. There would need to be a minimum number of years defined in the ruling, in which, at that point, if the person is eligible, they could file for parole. I couldn't find a minimum term or if he was sentenced with or without parole. As I've mentioned to you, Caitlin, sources on this were very limited and information out there was very limited. And I don't think it was necessarily just because it was the 80s. I also think that because this was the very first reported homicide in Olympic National Park, that people just tried to like hush this down a little bit. And that is part of the reason why sources were hard to find, especially because a lot of people consider national parks to be a safe place. And I mean, you don't want to cause fear. So if somebody learns like a murder happened here, like people are going to just by nature avoid that area. And so because a lot of the funding for the national parks comes through people paying to get into the national park, you don't want that number to go down.
Justice for Jane, though. She's still, and I agree, because the older cases that I've researched, there is a decent amount of information, not like new modern age cases where it's like you can figure out anything you want to, but hers seems to be buried deep. Like she is a blip. There's nothing hardly.
Yeah, and so I actually contacted the court that sentenced Dale because thanks to working in law, I know how to get court documents. And it's not a difficult process. Sometimes it just takes more legwork than, just typing in Google and finding things, especially because in the 80s it wasn't online, it was all paper.
Yeah.
So I contacted them and they were like, yeah, you would have to know the case number, and this is how you find the case number. So there's a program that you can use to find like case information, including the case number. And so I signed up with that, and it emailed me telling me that my account was active, but every time I try to sign in, it tells me that my account is inactive. And because like every single litigation lawyer in the United States uses this one program to look up court information, there's like a 3-week wait to get a response from them. So, especially because like I'm doing this as me as an individual, not in combination with the law firm that I work with. So,
Yeah.
like, I was like sitting there and I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, I could try to get this information, but I clearly didn't have it in time, and I don't know that it would actually provide any additional information about like Dale and his background, or if, I mean, things lined up close enough that they were able to nail him on this thing. They didn't need to like lay out his whole tragic life to show that he was like faulted in some way. Like they were just defending, like,
Of
you
course
know,
not. I'm saying for me personally, and for what, if I'm anywhere, if there's any reason for me to be on this podcast, is that I advocate talking about these things because certain things could either be prevented or we can lessen the amount of them. Because if we see a teenage 15-year-old, he didn't. Here's the thing, like, I think someone who's a disciplined serial killer is not going to sit there chatting to his best friend about what he's going to do. I
Yeah,
have a theory that this guy just was so obsessed, he had talked about it to anyone who would listen, at least somewhat close to him, not like strangers, but
yeah,
let's say he has some guy at a barbecue he's holding hostage in conversation. I'm just wondering, like, was he at 15 talking about this? Was he at 19, 20, mid 20s talking about this? There had to have been
yeah.
something, and no one said anything because it's like, oh, he's just weird. Oh, he's just write him off. No, we do not write those people off. Those are dangerous people. So,
Yes. Again, I do think that he probably had some instances in between, probably prior to the molestations when he was 19, that he didn't get punished for, or like they weren't put on record for him. So he had like those two instances, and then he went to jail, and then he got out, and then he was clean. But you know that in the 20 years between that time and when he committed this crime, that it didn't just sit and fester. He thought about it. He potentially scouted this place. He figured out what he was going to do. He was a big guy. Like over 6 feet is not something that like a lot of women look at and be like, ah, he's nothing. Like, especially when somebody has ill intentions, you can like feel it. I mean, most women can like feel it.
like, I am trying to work on getting my own podcast, but it's about relationships and dating, and I'm more interested in like the marriage part. But I feel like with dating, when people, women do ask me about it, even if it doesn't lead to death, there are dangerous people, like men. So my thing always is listen to what they say as truth. What they're saying is true. So if he's saying, yeah, I want to do some kinky here and there without consent or whatever, yeah, that's exactly what he means, and you should run the other way. So it's like,
Yeah.
if it doesn't lead to death, it can lead to other bad things. There's definitely red flags that are existing that are told to you point blank verbatim that you can be like, wow, register, act upon, leave.
That's something that I wish 20-year-old me would have had in the back of my head, because my ex told me all the time, like, if I can't have you, no one can. When I look back at that relationship and all of the years prior to that point, all the things he told me make sense. And I'm like, I just dismissed them. And so that's such a valid point to like not dismiss what is said and to take
Well,
it to heart.
I think it's easy for you to do, a 20-year-old you. I think that's easy to do.
I don't have anything else to add for the episode other than if you are interested in hearing more stories like this. Anne Rue, who's an author, she has a multiple book series called A Rage to Kill and Other True Cases. That's where I got a lot of the information for this story. And they're like chapters. So like each chapter is a different case. And so there was like 5 or 6 or maybe even more in this particular book. So if you want to check that out, you know what? I'll put a link in the description for the book. If anybody wants to check it out, I'll just make it easy for you. But yeah, that's what I got. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
I was just thinking that, like, I feel safer running in a park than I do my own neighborhood, and now I don't. So,
Sorry. Um,
hmm.
yeah, I think I it goes each way. It goes either way for me. I just have to like when I'm running, I just have to not think about it, because if I start thinking about it, I'm like, I'm dead. I'm not gonna come home from this run. Peace out, everybody. I love you. All right. Well, Caitlin, thank you for doing this with.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please take a moment to rate and subscribe from wherever you listen to Tragedy with a View. To get access to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more, please join us on our Patreon. The link will be in the show notes. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And to share a story of your own, send us a Campfire Confessional email at tragedywithaview@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.